topic, please.
All right, I hate to turn off the happy music, but my clock says 1 o'clock. So I am going to kick things off. We have a full agenda today. Welcome everybody to the 2022 Florida Online Innovation Summit. This is our 4th annual event, and this is our 2nd year online. We're pleased to share that we were sold out. So that's pretty exciting. Word is getting out and about. People are learning about the Florida Online Innovation Summit, which was founded to provide an opportunity to share and discuss projects that are being implemented across the state to advance the state of the art in online learning, particularly those that positively impact constraints of the Iron Triangle, which are quality, cost, and access for students. This started as a Florida event, so we want to thank the State University System of Florida Council of Academic Vice Presidents for funding and supporting this event. Going online made it much easier for us to open it up to our colleagues outside of the state of Florida. So we welcome everybody and thank you for coming. Just a little bit of housekeeping really quick is I wanted to bring to your attention, we are recording this event. So it's up to you if you would like to turn your camera on or not. It is being recorded. We will ask that you please stay muted though to minimize background noise until we get to the Q&A. When we get to the Q&A, we're certainly going to invite you to turn on your microphone if that helps with asking a question. Otherwise, we also have the chat going throughout the event. I want to take a moment, though, to thank our planning committee and our proposal reviewers. I hope you agree that our team put together a great program again this year. After our keynote address this afternoon, we will review that agenda together so that you know what to expect and how to navigate the program, moving in and out of different Zoom rooms this year as we grow to be much larger than we were last year. I will also share a little teaser, and that is one new item we added to our program this year is a digital poster session. So at 4 o'clock today, we will be moving into a different venue. So I think you'll enjoy an online experience that very closely mimics the type of poster session we're used to having that maybe we miss at this point from a traditional conference. So stay tuned after our keynote address. I will definitely explain how that's going to work and give you more information. The last thing before I introduce our keynote speaker is I'd like to invite Nicole to put the Zoom background or a link to the Zoom background in the chat. If you didn't get a chance to download that in advance, please feel free to download that background if you plan to turn on your camera. If it makes you feel like you're more closely tied to the event, we invite you to do that, but it's certainly not required. And with that, I would like to move into our keynote address to kick off today's program. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides so that our keynote can start to share his. But we are truly, truly honored to have Dr. Gregory, I can't talk today, Dr. Gregory Fowler as our keynote address today. He became the 7th president of the University of Maryland Global Campus, the nation's largest online public university, just in January of 2021. A nationally recognized scholar and leader in developing innovative learning models and experiences for adult and non-traditional populations, he served previously as president of Southern New Hampshire University's Global Campus. He also held senior level academic and administrative positions at the Western Governors University and Hesser College in New Hampshire. Hopefully you had a chance to view the Topcast episode that we sent out prior to this event. In the Topcast episode we sent, I think it was episode 90, Tom Cavanaugh interviewed Dr. Fowler, and we'll put that link in the chat just in case you missed it. But it was a great prelude to today's talk. Tom got to interview Dr. Fowler and get to know him a little bit better and on a personal note and talk about his philosophy on leadership in online learning, and hopefully it gave you an opportunity to get to know our featured speaker in advance. So you're really in for a big treat, and I'm certain that Dr. Fowler's remarks this afternoon will spark a great discussion. So please don't be shy. I will monitor the chat throughout his keynote address to collect your questions. And once he's ready for Q&A, I will assist with that. So if anything he says triggers a thought or a question, don't hesitate, throw it in the chat so that we have it ready when we move into Q&A. And certainly we will invite questions at the end if you haven't put it in throughout the keynote address. But right now, I don't want to take any more time away from him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gregory Fowler.
Thank you, Wendy, and welcome everyone. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss online innovation with you as our world emerges from a global pandemic that has pushed online learning quite abruptly into the national spotlight. Now, as we examine how institutions used, or in some cases, misused online instruction to navigate the lockdown, and we evaluate the lessons learned, I see certain trends emerging, and I've entitled my talk, Two Weddings and a Funeral. There are a couple of reasons for that. First, because I am a movie buff, and second, because it serves as shorthand for what I see happening across much of higher education, and what is sure to continue happening right along our responses to the pandemic: the marriage of access with innovation, the marriage of sustainable business models with academic quality, and ultimately the death of the status quo. Now, I should point out that I chose the marriage analogy for a reason, because marriages are rarely trouble-free, and it takes an intentional effort for them to succeed. And for those familiar with Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, I think the funeral analogy is equally apt when discussing higher education status quo. So, how do we navigate the shifting sands in higher education and bring together access and innovation, quality, and affordability? Online learning is enticing in its potential, but as the pandemic has demonstrated, it doesn't represent a panacea, and long-term solutions will require us to think outside the box and perhaps expand our definitions. My own institution, University of Maryland Global Campus, was an early adopter of online instruction, and it's focused from its inception on adult students in the workforce and the military, populations that most agree that have been poorly served by traditional higher education. We were founded in 1947, and now, exactly 75 years later, happy anniversary, that mission of serving underserved populations continues to guide us. Often our decisions revolve around a simple question: how do we get the right solution into the hands of the people who need them the most and who may not already have that access? Some turn almost reflectively to technology. It is certainly true that technology enables almost everything we do, and that new and exciting technologies are brought to market nearly every day. The students we serve, however, come to higher education with a broad range of expectations, life experiences, and levels of preparation. For us to truly meet them where they are, understand their goals and objectives, and deliver the learning experiences they need, innovation cannot be limited to technology. Rather, we must embrace it as part of the very fabric of our institution and culture. Our approach to partnerships offers one particularly relevant example. We've long maintained partnerships with community colleges and corporations, as well as with government and community organizations. Typically, these partnerships offered access to academic programs that align, perhaps loosely, with the company or organization's priorities, packaged with group discounts or other incentives. While these arrangements were productive and drove enrollments to some degree, they were also unidirectional and somewhat limited in scope. Now, as we pursue new partnerships or expand existing ones, we are broadening our expectations and exploring ways to leverage the partner organization's particular expertise, market reach, and scale to further our own mission and increase our efficiency and effectiveness in serving students. The partnerships we are forming with Excellency in education offer a specific example. Not only does it promise to help improve our understanding of how to remove common barriers for first-generation learners, it also allows us to better support the education goals of the Latino community. This, to me, is a much more representative and inclusive example of a true partnership. Of course, if we marry access with innovation, it expands our market appeal, greatly simplifying the second half of the equation, marrying sustainable business models with academic quality. And as it happens, the partnerships we pursue are also components of a business model that reduces risk and our vulnerability to market sector volatility by cultivating multiple revenue streams while providing greater leeway to maintain a competitive cost structure. If there's one thing I've learned by studying UMGC's history, it is that there will always be another disruptor, a pandemic, perhaps, or a tsunami, or a global military conflict. While we cannot predict the future, we can broaden and diversify operations in ways that help make us more future-proof. That said, we cannot and do not pursue growth for growth's sake. Educational alliances with global companies like Amazon, Uber, and Mantech, as well as some of the country's largest community college systems, and the federal government promise to expand our reach. And while these opportunities are common across higher education, to respond to them successfully, we must be willing to truly listen, seek to understand why learners or organizational partners have come to us, and be willing and able to tailor learning experiences to their specific needs, instead of simply selling prepackaged solutions. In the post-pandemic world, many are rethinking their priorities, and we must be ready to respond. Those who are part of the Great Resignation will need new skills, but they won't drop everything to attend class full-time and face-to-face. To meet them where they are, we will have to create learning experiences rapidly and responsively, without compromising quality. And we will have to bring the voices of our corporate and community partners into the design process. It is equally important that our learning experiences deliver what they promise. The KSADs, that is the knowledge, skills, abilities, and dispositions that students and employers alike want and need. This is consistent with the way we define academic quality, which we measure in terms of student outcomes. It is critical that institutions take steps to maintain that quality at scale. At UMGC, standardization helps ensure quality, while also improving the user experience, while regular assessments and oversight generate the feedback necessary to keep us on a path of constant improvement. Through academic affairs, we offer centralized curriculum and a master template for each course, designed to ensure that coursework aligns with program outcomes and contributes to consistent student outcomes. A faculty course coordinator monitors every course, works with adjuncts who teach the course, and makes course improvements based on student and faculty input. Links in our online classroom offer direct and immediate access to tutoring, library services, our writing center, and other support services. Academic affairs coordinates closely with student affairs to better understand the student experience, particularly as it relates to curricular relevance and our success at preparing graduates to apply their learnings in real-world settings. And finally, we gather data from students for every single course, evaluating the quality of classroom design and experience, course materials, and faculty performance. We see student services and support as equal contributors to quality. So we've also established a new student affairs unit that brings together and coordinates teams from across the university that provide academic and administrative student support functions, and we've transitioned to a student advising success coaching model. We also train faculty in principles of coaching, mentoring, fostering a growth mindset, and structuring feedback so that it's personalized, instructive, and improves students' in-classroom performance. This is consistent with our belief, borne out by statistical evidence, that students typically fail or drop out, not because they cannot master the course content, but because life happens. With that in mind, we strive to ensure that our academic offerings are underpinned by a foundation of service that is unprecedented and perhaps unexpected in higher education, wrapping students in a blanket of support that is easily accessible and responds to the realities of their lives, academic backgrounds, and learning styles. Again, this requires that we listen closely, think outside the box, and question even our most cherished assumptions. The students with the most to gain from higher education are often those whose needs have been overlooked in most traditional learning environments. Many of them have come of age at a time when housing, healthcare, and education are promised only to those willing to assume crippling burdens of debt if they are fortunate enough to have access to them at all. Even before the pandemic, some 40 million Americans have attended college without completing a degree and have little to show for it except debt and the belief that they aren't college material. Another 40 million have no post-secondary learning experience in a global economy that increasingly demands it. These are the students we must find a way to help succeed. The challenges that they face when returning to school include common ones like time management, financial hardship, and a lack of familiarity with academic norms. Those are further complicated by the more fundamental challenges that they face in their day-to-day lives. Challenges related to childcare, mental health, and even hunger. To serve them effectively, we are again exploring partnerships with community organizations and looking to them for guidance, expertise, and the bandwidth necessary to address the challenges associated with bringing education within reach for all learners. Addressing those challenges is neither quick nor easy. Some months ago, I moderated a discussion about America's education deserts and the estimated 41 million Americans whose lives where they have no college or university, and the estimated 41 million Americans who live where they have no college or university within 25 miles, or where a single community college is the only broad access public institution within 25 miles. Some respond with a metaphorical shrug, pointing to the ubiquity of broadband internet and expecting online instruction to bridge the gap, when in fact, some 3 million of those 41 million lack reliable access to high-speed internet. If we ignore those equity gaps, even as classrooms become increasingly technology rich, we will only replicate the problems that have plagued higher education for decades. And the resources necessary to access online instruction will quickly become their own obstacles to success. Because of our contractual relationship with the US military, UMGC maintains some 180 locations around the globe that offer instruction and/or academic services and support. And we are now exploring ways that we can leverage that infrastructure to better serve local communities and civilian populations. At the same time, we're looking at how libraries and community centers might serve individuals who lack Wi-Fi connectivity or a suitable study space, given their living arrangements. As we seek to establish a sustainable business model without compromising academic quality, we are leveraging analytics to identify our successes and areas of opportunity, and using this information to inform our decision-making around the launch of new programs and where and how best to market them. Some years ago, UMGC replaced costly publisher textbooks with open educational resources, what you probably know as OERs. And that has translated into considerable savings for many of our students. Now, however, we are digging deeper into our records to ensure that selected resources aren't structured in a way that hampers accessibility efforts or limits access or student success to specific groups of people. And we're tackling the issue of prior learning assessments, PLA, and how to do it equitably and at scale. In the end, I suspect that the death of the status quo will be confirmed when we, as educators, are fully and finally aware that we must truly listen to students, seek to understand their needs and realities, and respond with learning experiences that marry access and innovation, sustainability, and quality. An industry that has spent 1,000 years teaching must now exponentially increase its ability to learn. That will demand every ounce of innovation and discipline that we can muster. And I cannot think of a more worthy outlet for our energies. I thank you for your interest in this critically important discussion, your willingness to explore broader definitions of innovation, and your belief in the power of education to transform lives and make our world better and brighter now and for generations to come. Thank you. And now I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fowler. I've been monitoring the chat, and I invite anybody who has a question to please submit it in the chat. Or if you would like, you can also use the raise your hand feature down at the bottom of your screen and I can acknowledge you to just unmute your microphone if you'd like, and you can just ask your question live. So either use the raise hand or put it in the chat. I do see one that came up. I'm curious to hear more about the coaching models replacing the traditional advising model. I was going to ask the same thing about success coaches. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Absolutely. So one of the things you will see in a lot of institutions, particularly those who are doing online work, is something we call a success coach. You may see a student advisor model. Some people even call them Sherpas. And this is different than what you would see in a traditional model, because what you're talking about isn't just advising in the way of a student comes by a couple of times for how are we going to take a class, but it really is someone who's built up over a period of time the ability to build a relationship with the various students that they're working with. So when it comes to what makes students succeed or not, what we're finding more and more is that this has little to do with the inability to get the content. It really is when life happens, whether it is something with a personal issue or with a professional issue, how do we begin to help that student through those types of things? So the new coaching model is just that. Somebody who builds that relationship, who says, when you start to struggle, let me help you remember why you came to do this type of thing. Let me help you figure out what the solution might be as you continue to move forward, and figures out a way to keep you going. At the various institutions I've worked at, certainly at Southern New Hampshire University and at Western Governors, when we ask students at the time of graduation, what's the biggest thing that led to your success? Almost all of them say, yes, the faculty members were critical, but when I began to struggle, what really got me through was that relationship with that advisor. So this is a different type of skill set that you're going to be required to have if you're trying to do this type of thing, that requires building a relationship and an understanding of what motivates someone, understands why they why they came to you in the first place, and what they need to keep going.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. We also had two folks ask a little bit more about PLA at scale. So thank you, Mark Lewis and Leslie Lockett, who are asking, can you expand upon the PLA at scale, and are there specific fields that may be impacted?
Sure. Prior learning assessment, and we often talk about PLA, but there's also something called CLA, current learning assessment, that we're talking a lot about these days as well. Prior learning assessment tends to mean you've done something before you started your educational experience that leads you to get some type of credit during the college experience. But in real time, students are still outside of the classroom gaining new skill sets. And given certainly our population with the military and some of the other professional areas, what we're hearing from a lot of them is, can we get credit for these things that we have had? Now, this requires a totally different skill set, and a whole lot of institutions that I know that are doing innovative things are trying to figure out how to do this at scale, because of course you've got CLEP and Dante's and you've got sort of the portfolio models. But in most of these instances, what a lot of students will say is, by the time I get through doing all of those types of things, I might as well just take the class. So how do we think differently about scaling up some type of prior learning assessment models? And there are a number of places that are working on elements of this right now. For example, I know we've been working with WGU and the Open Skills Network to clearly define what are the skills that are going to be tied to these different types of experiences, and how do we tag them in a way that allows them to scale as we continue to move forward. That's going to be particularly true in areas like the professional areas, business, even in some cases, things like healthcare, because for a lot of our students who are in the military, for example, there are things they're allowed to do in the military that if they want to do those things after they get out, they have to get a credential to actually work with that cybersecurity, for example. So how do we think about building out infrastructures that allow us to rapidly do those types of things, and across hopefully multiple institutions, so that we can have a common currency about what those skills will look like? That's one of the pieces that I think a lot of people have been having a hard time trying to build out, but I know a number of institutions are trying to do.
Yeah, there's still a lot more work to be done there, but I think we're off to a good start. Our next question comes from Heather Olson, and she asks, how do you balance the need for academic freedom with consistency in garnering faculty support for a master course template?
Can you say that last part again for me, please?
Sure. How do you balance the need for academic freedom with consistency in garnering faculty support for a master course template model?
Oh, yes, this is a great question. And I've seen it at every place I've ever worked, because you don't want, in fact, the role of the faculty member, I got to talking a minute ago about the advisor, but the other side of that is trying to find ways to make sure that the instructor or the faculty member is able to connect most directly with the student in ways that allows them to move things forward. That's going to be the critical piece. The bottom line, and sometimes I get myself in trouble by saying this type of thing, but the bottom line is that in a lot of ways, the content of Intro to Psych across the thousands of schools has fundamentally probably the similar outcomes and similar content. There are only so many textbooks or so many things when it comes to the actual content or learning resource. the real magic in the learning experience happens in the magic of the connection between students and faculty. So I mentioned I love movies. The one I use a lot is The Karate Kid. And some of you may have even heard this if you heard saw my interview with Tom not too long ago. One of the pieces about what works in The Karate Kid, even though I know the story's not true, is that you've got a student who doesn't have the normal access. So when you're talking about equity issues, Daniel LaRusso in this story doesn't have the money to join a dojo, probably is not the kind of student who's going to be thriving in a dojo, even if he could join one. But he does have an instructor, Mr. Miyagi, who knows him, who has a relationship with him, who has the resources and the skills to help him. And he finds a way to marry the needs of Daniel and the environment in which he operates with the ultimate goals that he has to have. He still has to ultimately take the same assessment, i.e. the tournament. So for those of you watching Cobra Kai, you know what I'm talking about as well. So, but this whole idea of how do you do that? How do you make that work? Is what the instructor really is going to be there for. So I often say to instructors, if anything, we are giving you more room for academic freedom because the fundamental centralized things we've already set up through the instructional design process in a way that allows you to now say, now, how do I take this and connect with that specific student? So I see it as in some ways an enhancement of academic freedom rather than being a limited piece to it.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't think you can see the chat from where you're standing. So I'll just share that Lisa Martino added a supporting comment in the chat. You know, at first she says she didn't like working with templates, but now understand how important consistency and alignment with learning outcomes is important. And templates do also allow faculty time to connect with the students. So I think that
I think when it also allows for people to be very deliberate and intentional about what is the experience that they're putting in front of the student and what are the outcomes? Because in a lot of instances, especially if you've been teaching something for a long period of time, being able to think through how will the population of students who I'm about to teach differ from the ones before, and what will they need to be successful are critical pieces of this that I think are absolutely important. That's all the more so, and now I'm thinking about the relationship between the instructor, academic freedom, the instructional designer, the assessment specialist, and all of them. And what I say to them is you need all of those skill sets, because if you know anything about expertise, the more expert at something that you become, the harder often it is to identify with the novice who's trying to do this from the other side. So having an instructional designer that will help you be intentional about that is a superpower and a strength and something that you should leverage and see as an opportunity rather than as a threat. You just have to be able to use it that way.
And what a great shout out to all the instructional designers in the audience. Thank you.
We couldn't do it without you.
Yeah. I have another question in the chat, which goes in a totally different direction, but it's very important. I think we've always been aware of inequity issues regarding internet access, but it's been so amplified in the last year or two. We have a question from Rai R on how are you increasing Wi-Fi accessibility that you kind of referred to earlier? What steps are you taking? What are you able to do to address this?
So I think there are a couple of things you want to do around Wi-Fi, because all of us have probably seen those, well, not all of us, but a lot of us seen those images of students sitting in parking lots to get Wi-Fi at the library or sometimes near the campus because they don't necessarily have it. So I think there are two ways that I'd approach this. The first is trying to make sure that we actually build experiences that don't increase the equity gap between the haves and have-nots when it comes to these types of things. So a lot of times we get back to this idea of innovation and technology, and you see people at a lot of the conferences that we go to talking about these brilliant, broad scenarios and simulations that they've brought out there. And I'm like, that's really clever and I really like it, but you know, what about if you just create an experience that requires an Oculus and this thing costs $400, are we really getting further and further away from the people who need us the most to do those types of things? So how do you create these experiences? And it's one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about, because you've got these various scenarios, whether you're on a military base, on a submarine, or you sitting in your house. How do we think about creating experiences that are effective, relatively straightforward, and can be applied in various scenarios? It's a big challenge that I'll put out there again for both faculty and instructional designers to try to think about and try to work their way through. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that we can do when it comes to making sure we do that. Designing experiences that work for those types of things. And then also partnering, as I mentioned in my comments, with various organizations around the area. So I was at a couple of years ago working with the city of Birmingham In fact, I was not too far from where I'm standing right now. They just built a brand new library, and I'm driving down. I'm going, I wonder how many old textbooks they have in these libraries now. Most of this is about using them as a learning center where the community can come together and use those types of things. So how do we think about doing those types of things and using various spaces that are public spaces to allow for exactly the same types of things as well? Can colleges partner with local community centers, with libraries, with cities to say, we want to make sure we help those who you're trying to help the most in that type of thing as we move forward. So that's how it really try to approach it, both from a design perspective and an access perspective through the resource that might be available in the local communities.
Thank you. That's very insightful. We have a ton of questions that are actually piling up in the chat. So forgive me if it's like a firing squad, bam, bam, bam. But we have another one from Pamela Thompson, who asks, can you give an example of centralized curriculum from your perspective and experience?
So sure, and if you think, you talked a minute ago about one of the triangles. The other triangle that you talk about a lot of when you think about instructional design is starting with outcomes that you're trying to have. How are you going to measure those outcomes through assessment, and what are the learning resources that are going to help the students get the skills that they're trying to talk about? At every one of those stages, you've got to have an intentional design process. And you've got to have partners, hopefully, if you're talking about workforce relevance, from some of the businesses you're working with, partnered with some of the academic units that you're trying to work with. So at most of the places when I've seen this type of thing happen, generally what happens is on the first day of the work, you have the academics who come into the room and you have the practitioners who come into the room, and you ask the question, on the first day of the job, if you are doing, let's just say, one I remember most recently is political science. If you were trying to become a political campaign director, what's the things you need to do on the very first day of the job? What do you need to know, do, and be if you're going to try to have those skill sets? And the academics will come up with a list, and the practitioners will come up with a list, and the list won't match. Because you're talking about two very different experiences. And what you spend the next couple of days doing is shaping that experience in such a way that you come to a point where you say, now we have a clear delineation of, here are the outcomes we would expect that we now agree on. Then you have to get into the assessment pieces of that and think about now what are the various ways we're going to measure this? And this is one of those pieces where equity can also come into play. Again, we're talking about not just one way of measuring a standard test or a paper or a project, but thinking about the communities you're trying to serve and the ways where those things may be assessed differently than the ways that you might be familiar with. I go back to my Karate Kid reference, for example. Then, of course, you get into the questions around learning resources and how do we begin to build out the various experiences that are going to get students those skill sets. Again, thinking about equity issues across the board. That deliberate process is something that allows you to say, it doesn't matter whether I've got 4 instructors or 400 instructors, these fundamental pieces are in the experience across the board and are the things that we would expect to see. Now, and then, of course, that's when the instructor comes in and says, okay, I fundamentally understand this stuff. I'm an expert in the area. I'm also working with various students. Now let me bring my skill set and building that relationship and making that learning happen in that way. So that's what we mean by centralized, to the extent that, and you see this in different ways already. If you think about it, a lot of schools have a core curriculum. A lot of schools have, here's the reading list, or here are these series of books. Even when I was at Penn State, when we were teaching the writing class, everybody used the same compendium for that particular class. You could teach various pieces out of it, but everybody said, this book has the resources that we want to use. So how do we think about doing that as we move forward? It's something that hopefully seems as an opportunity. Again, not a threat if you do it the right way.
Thank you. Thank you. And people are loving your Karate Kid reference, by the way.
I'm telling you, if you haven't seen Cobra Kai, go look it up.
Yes. So in addition to the instructional designers in the audience, we have additional faculty, staff, and administrators who are leaders in online innovation. And I think we can all agree that culture change and implementing new programs can be difficult and time consuming. And we talked about a whole bunch of different topics today, but if you had to boil it down to one takeaway item, what do you see as an immediate first step? One thing we could all do tomorrow to start to positively impact underserved students. Is there one small thing that we can start with immediately to initiate change?
So I will say this, and this is actually true for both the classroom and just organizations in general. I think my experience has always been the single hardest thing for people to do is learn to listen. To build in the tools or resources that truly allow you to create a user-friendly experience and to hear what the needs are and where students are struggling. So that doesn't require you to go out and buy any types of large systems, but it does require you to find mechanisms by which you can actually say, is this really what our students are asking for us? Are we giving them what they're coming here for? Or are we trying to give them a sort of one size fits all product that we have sold for years and we feel comfortable with? One or the other of us have to get out of our comfort zone. And sometimes both of us. But I think in this case, being able to say to people, what are the ways in which we are truly becoming learner centric? I mean, people throw that term around a lot, but you don't always find a lot of people who start with, if I'm walking through this experience as a learner, people hear me say, you may have heard me say before as well, that my first job out of college was Six Flags. And at Six Flags, we spent a lot of time during the off season setting up user experiences. Where are the restaurants going to be? Which shows are we going to show where? If the new ride is here, what do we anticipate people doing and how we expect them to go through the park? Learning experiences are the same way. If we're being deliberate and intentional about it and listening, because sometimes you'll be trying to build this. When I was building out a system in one of the LMSs once, we thought we'd done this wonderful thing, and I won't say which one, but we built out this landscape and this pathway through the experience, and the students did exactly the opposite of all the things we designed. And so being able to say, well, we didn't anticipate, right? That wasn't a, why won't they go down the path we wrote? It was like, so apparently this is as water flowing down the hill, this is the easiest path for them to go down. So how do we rethink that, and how do we take that and create an experience that's going to be more powerful for them moving forward? So it's really that ability, first and foremost, to start not with what your assumptions are, but do you have an understanding of who your students are and what they're asking of you through some type of listening infrastructure or mechanism.
And that's really great advice, because I think we can all recognize institutional context varies from one school to another. And so I think we all have a slightly different set of students that we're serving, and it's important to find out what their specific needs are.
I think that's so.
Yeah, and I think things have slowed down a little bit in the chat. So I want to give folks one more opportunity to either raise your hand or put a question in the chat before we slowly start to wrap up with our final question. Anything else you'd like to squeeze in? Feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat for us. All right. Well, then I think I just have one last question for you, Dr. Fowler, before we wrap up. This has been so informative, and you're getting lots of thank yous in the chat. And that is, in light of today's discussion, do you have any advice for aspiring leaders in our field of online learning? One last bit of advice.
That's a whole new series. That's a whole new presentation by itself. I think there are a couple of things I would say. One, you've heard me talk about the idea of technology here, and not seeing technology and chasing the Joneses, as I like to call it, or keeping up with the Joneses. There are a lot of people who are trying to, for any number of reasons, get caught up in the bright, shiny objects, or we're going to implement something because it's going to chase the headlines. No two institutions are going to be the same. I've now worked at 3 of the largest and most innovative institutions in the country when it comes to this type of stuff. And I will tell you that behind the scenes, they are very different from each other. So sometimes you see similar things, but I think you want to go into this not trying to follow someone else, but having a true understanding of what's your mission, what's the best way to serve the students that are your population, and what are the tools that you can actually leverage and be comfortable with that. It's very easy to get caught up in, oh, they're doing these types of things. And I was thinking of, maybe 6 or 7 years ago during the MOOC craze. You may recall that I think it was the University of Virginia. I could be wrong about that, but I think it was the University of Virginia that actually the board came in and temporarily terminated their president because she wasn't pursuing enough MOOCs at the time. She eventually did get her job back. But it was, why are you chasing MOOCs? Is that your mission? But it became, well, everybody else is doing it, so it must be the right thing to do. So I want to always make sure we have a clear sense of our purpose, the resources we have, the audiences we're trying to serve, and then let the technology support those types of things, as opposed to letting them drive those things for headline purposes. I mean, that's the best advice I think I can give, is just know who you are, know who your students are, know where you're trying to go.
Well, thank you. I think that's very great advice to end on. So I want to thank you on behalf of all of our participants in this event across the state of Florida and also outside of Florida. Thank you so much for your advice, your insights, and all of your comments in today's keynote address. What a great way to kick off our event. Thank you. Thank you. I will take a couple of minutes to kind of set up the rest of the program, but I invite you, Dr. Fowler, if you would like to just stay logged in for another minute or two. You may see some straggling comments or questions in the chat. You're welcome to respond to there in the chat. But I will go ahead and encourage